We're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and pursue the truth with FBI whistleblowers and founding suspendables Garrett O'Boyle and Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast. Good morning, folks. Welcome here to rumble.com/amradpod. Grateful to have you along with us today. Reminder, please give us a thumbs up. Follow the channel here on Rumble. If you listen to us on iTunes and Spotify and iHeart, definitely subscribe so you can get the new episodes when they drop on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, normally 10:30 Eastern time. We're still trying to build out all the different platforms. We're working on Instagram. We've got the YouTube channel. We're also at X America News. So trying and endeavoring to radicalize more Americans. And today is no exception. Well, there's going to be a slight exception because at GOB Actual is not with us today. But that doesn't mean that myself, at Real Steve Friend, is flying solo. Today we're going to be doing sort of a sit down, an interview, if you will, or more of just digging into all things January 6th, which is not behind us. Despite what President Trump did on day one in his second term, where he pardoned so many people who were caught up in that event, that trial and tribulation is not over for a lot of people. And I can think of no one better to walk us through some of the stuff that he's working on over at The Blaze than Joe Hanneman, who's friend of the Suspendables. So we're going to bring on Joe in a minute. But before I do, want to make sure that we thank the underwriting sponsor for today's program, which is the M-Clip Company, m-clip.com. m-clip.com is where you can go and use our promo code SUSPENDABLE, SUSPENDABLE, to get 10% off of these really cool money clips. This is an interesting company. It's American owned. It's a family business. They've been in business for a couple decades, lifetime guarantee, luxury goods that will not break the bank. You'll actually have money to put into the money clip afterwards. You get your initials monogrammed on them. If you like baseball, they have your favorite teams there. You can even get the Suspendables logos and emblems. Everything is 10% off at m-clip.com. And the promo code is Suspendables. Also a really good Father's Day gift. So check them out, guys. And without further ado, let's bring on a friend of the Suspendables. I contend he's a Suspendable himself. Joe Hanneman, now writing over at The Blaze. Good to see you, my friend. Appreciate you giving me some time now that you're a big timer over there. I see you're like dropping stories like 2-3 times a week. And I enjoy reading them, and we like to cover down on them, but it's always good to get the firsthand perspective of a guy who's doing the real big J journalism as opposed to just inserting their editorializing and aggregating their information from social media and assuming that that's probably accurate. So thanks again for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So I alluded to in the beginning, January 6th, well, it's over now, right? That's what we were reliably informed by so many people because America is so back, baby. We're based now, no problems, everything is hunky-dory. But in essence, in reality, that's not really true. And I want to sort of work our way through some of the things that you've been dropping, and you drop them, I said, very regularly. And let's kind of, I guess, work our way backwards a little bit because I know this week everyone's talking about the riots that are ongoing, or the mostly peaceful riots in Los Angeles, and how the National Guard has been deployed and we're sending other military resources there. And there was this talking point about the National Guard on January 6th. And now I think some of the Democrats in Congress are saying that the National Guard wasn't promoted or wasn't actually proposed, but you wrote a piece over at Blaze that just disputes this entirely and brings the facts. So what do you know about Trump authorizing National Guards for January 6th?
Well, the crazy thing about this is that, the Democrats never pass up an opportunity to twist the truth. And Representative Benny Thompson went on X on a Sunday evening and claimed President Trump refused to authorize the National Guard for duty on January 6th, which Benny Thompson knows that's not true. He has been somebody who has been reliably tells falsehoods. He also has claimed on national television that 2 police officers were murdered at the Capitol that day. But the National Guard one's especially pernicious. They trot this out whenever they can. And the truth is that President Trump authorized up to 20,000 National Guard troops. And this was done 3 days ahead of January 6th in a meeting in the Oval Office. He was very concerned that it would be a safe day and a safe event for everybody. So he directed, he authorized, like I say, 20,000. And General Markham Lee was in that meeting, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, along with the acting Defense Secretary Chris Miller and his chief deputy, a guy that we know, Kash Patel. So they were all in that meeting and heard him give that authorization. But that's all he could do. He can't force the National Guard to show up at the Capitol. It's something that has to be requested under the Constitution, except in some rare circumstances. So the DOD, the Department of Defense, did go to the mayor of Washington, D.C., and offered National Guard. And she flat out rejected it on January 5th. She sent a letter to the DOD and said, no thanks. Uh, so she was one avenue to get the Guard there. The other is federal law enforcement, the Capitol Police. And the then chief, Steve Sund, did go again days in advance and ask the Capitol Police Board to declare an emergency so they could request National Guard troops to come in. And he was turned down by the House Sergeant at Arms and the Senate Sergeant at Arms. And that those decisions would come back to haunt everyone on actual January 6th, where the chief just struggled mightily, practically begging the Pentagon to send the authorized troops.
Can you elaborate on the sergeant of arms for the House and the Senate? Because it's my understanding, as it's been reported, maybe I'm misinformed, that basically the Speaker of the House has overall command and control, for lack of a better term, of security matters. But there is this police chief who's in charge of U.S. Capitol Police, and now there's the sergeant at arms. How does that work, and how would that decision actually be made officially?
Yeah, the chain of command comes down from the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader in the Senate. They both oversee the sergeant at arms in each chamber and have the authority over them. And the sergeants at arms are two of the three members of the Capitol Police Board that controls the Capitol Police and is responsible for security in and around the Capitol grounds. So uh, the truth is, on January 6th, Speaker Nancy Pelosi was in firm control. Mitch McConnell, who was the majority leader at the time, really didn't have any involvement. So Pelosi was really pulling the strings, and she's told a lot of different stories trying to cover herself. Um, but the truth is, the Democrats stood in the way. They stood in the way at the Capitol. And they stood in the way at the Pentagon. And poor Chief Sund, who did the right thing, like I said, he was practically in tears, begging them because things had gone south very badly, and they were talking to him about optics and that it wouldn't look right. And he wasn't concerned about optics at that point. He didn't want anybody to get hurt.
Well, the optics thing kind of gets me because I can see both ways being an optic concern. So in the lead up to it, and this is, I guess, where you get into like the speculation, maybe even sort of like a conspiracy theory, that the Democrats wanted to sort of like stir the pot up enough and bring down security measures enough so that something bad could happen. I mean, you could make that logical deduction. We're still waiting to get a concrete proof of that in order to make that allegation. But on the day of, when there is the unrest and you have the violence happening outside the Capitol, you have the police chief of the Capitol Police saying, I need manpower. I'm asking for the National Guard. And there's this delay because they don't want to have the optics of National Guard in full uniform out there interacting with the American people. It looks, to their perspective, like a Stasi. But what about the other element that the Democrats at that point should have been hungry for? And they want to have like a tank rolling up onto the steps of the Capitol to just show how bad these MAGA Republicans are. I mean, do you pick a side in either one of those, or do you think that it was just kind of as a result of the analysis, there was paralysis when it came time to actually pulling the trigger on deploying the troops?
Oh, I think it was absolutely intentional to withhold the Guard. Uh, I'm surprised the Guard got there at all that day. I think the one of the goals of the day was to have a you know what show, and that it would just be a disaster on national TV, something they could use to figuratively hang President Trump. So, this, over really trumped, no pun intended, but the instincts of some of the people like Chief Son to do some pre-planning days in advance. He sensed, even though he wasn't getting good intelligence, he sensed there was a possibility that things would go badly, and he really was misserved, and this was hung around his neck, the failure of security. When the truth is, Pelosi certainly, uh, had a big role in the delay, and then the Capitol Police Board also didn't cooperate, until the Capitol building had been breached and there were people streaming in, and then they finally authorized Son to go to the Pentagon, where he encountered a whole new round of interference from the woke generals at the Pentagon. And it wasn't really until after 3 p.m. that the ball started to roll. But the first guardsman did not step foot on the Capitol grounds till 5:30, and the fight was over.
Yeah.
Son had brought in 1,700 mutual aid cops from the Capital region, and they retook the Capitol.
I think they brought in cops from New Jersey that got there before the National Guard, which was staged, I don't know, as the crow flies away from the actual location, correct?
Yes, the New Jersey State Police arrived well in advance of the Quick Reaction Force from the DC National Guard. They were blocks away, sitting on buses. I mean, they trained for this all the time, and for them it was painful because they knew what was going on, and General Walker and his troops were ready to go, and then they were stymied at it. And it was the first time in 119 years that this group of guardsmen was not able to protect the Capitol in the time of a riot.
And interestingly enough, they kept them there after the fact. I mean, they were sleeping in parking garages because they had to erect all the anti-scale fencing around Washington, D.C., make it look like it was in a war zone up into the inauguration of Joe Biden, and then even beyond that. So they were kind of used both ways. So once they're weaponized to not act, and then subsequently activated in order to, I guess, present this strong face there. Now, away from this issue, I want to get into like the more personal stories that you've done a really good job of. I want to start on Ashley Babbitt because she's the most well-known person from January 6th, or one of the most well-known, certainly one of the most well-known fatalities, not the only one, but the family of the Babbitt family has been going through some tribulations for the last 5 years. And you've been covering down on it. And again, I want to work our way through this because this has been a lawsuit that was brought forward on behalf of Ashley Babbitt, her family, her estate. And there has been quite a bit of tumult involved in it through the court processes, through a legal representation, and ultimately culminated with the settlement. But before we get to that happy ending, let's talk about how it originally began. And you wrote about her and this settlement in principle. This was, I mean, not too long ago. I mean, it was May. I'm talking like 6 weeks ago. I heard this and I actually reached out to you, and it was kind of like news to you at the time because it was getting leaked. You thought $30 million in a wrongful death suit. Was the genesis of leaking this or putting this out there? And what did you write about here about 6 weeks ago, Joe?
Well, the Department of Justice, which of course represented the federal government in this civil suit, insists that they did not leak the amount of the settlement, but I really don't know where else it could have come from. I'm reasonably confident that Judicial Watch, which represents Aaron Babbitt in the $30 million suit, did not leak that amount. So I think they were getting some internal interference from some holdovers at the DOJ. I mean, it was President Trump being inaugurated for his second term that really made this settlement possible. They were fully prepared to go to trial. They were forced to relocate this case from San Diego, where the Babbitts lived, to the friendly confines of DC, friendly for the DOJ, that is. And that was a fight that was ongoing at the time that the settlement came about. So what they ended up settling on financially was just shy of $5 million, which, I think some people have reacted that it seems like fairly low amount. And you know, I think that's an acknowledgement of what an advantage the government had if they went to trial in D.C., and it would have been a very difficult row to hoe. So, you know, I think it was a question of just taking the best that could be had and, and moving on from there.
They certainly moving the venue to Washington, D.C. was interesting because of the judges that constitute that district. I have a story of yours from that. Before I get to that, there are elements of the story that you've discussed that I bring them up to people all the time when I am interacting in public, and this inevitably Ashley Babbitt's name gets brought up to me just because of who I am and the crowds that I'm speaking to, and they do not know some of the details of the story, including how Lieutenant Byrd was on the radio after shooting Ashley Babbitt, and you did a really good job of digging that up. For the audience that might not be aware, because we actually have grown a little bit on the American Radicals podcast. Can you dig into like how bad it was and how justified this sort of wrongful death lawsuit would have been in light of the way that Lieutenant Byrd comported himself in the lead up and the actual shooting and then in the following days?
You know, one of the real tragedies of this whole thing is how Ashley Babbitt has been just badly smeared, and not just in the corporate press. There's just been this general attitude out there that she somehow deserved this, or that she was a violent rioter who led a crazy mob to the edge of the House Speaker's lobby, and none of that's true. I mean, yes, she was there. She came to Washington to see Trump speak. She walked to the Capitol by herself. She was not, her husband had stayed back to run the family business. So she made it up to the entrance of the speaker's lobby by herself. She did not cause any violence. She did not vandalize anything. She did not harass anyone. She followed directions of some of the police officers that said, you need to go this way. And she ended up in a position that eventually cost her her life. But she did try to stop the rioting that erupted in that hallway, which I think was very contrived. There were a couple of men, primarily a Virginia man, Zachary Alam, who just erupted in violence and started, punching the glass in the doors. And he eventually took a Kevlar helmet and smashed out the glass. So he was really the point man on that. And she tried screaming at him. She tried grabbing him to get his attention. Eventually, she grabbed his backpack, spun him around, and punched him right in the nose, gave him a left hook. And that was the end of the rioting. But unfortunately for everyone, she climbed up in a sidelight window and was immediately shot to death by Lieutenant Michael Byrd, who was in a hidden position, who kind of slinked out and fired at her from a very sharp angle. She definitely did not see him. She did not hear him, so she didn't know he was there. And with her experience as an MP in the Air Force and the Air National Guard, she would have obeyed any lawful command. But she didn't hear it. She didn't see it. Lieutenant Byrd, like I said, he kind of crept out of this hidden position. He put his finger on the trigger, he took it off. He put it on, he took it off for about 15 seconds. And then when she appeared, his hands kind of dipped, and I guess they call it pushing the shot. He pushed the shot and hit her in the left anterior shoulder. Um, and from that point on, things just went even further south. He did not approach the window, did not close on her as a suspect to see what happened. And then, of course, they would have cuffed her if that was, if he had been doing procedure, and then to render medical aid. None of that was done. He disappeared into another room and went on the radio and claimed that he was under fire. He lied and said, we're taking fire. We have guns drawn. We're prepared to fire back. An absolute ludicrous statement. I don't know why he uttered it. He's never spoken to that. We were the ones who disclosed that by listening to the communications and the radio chatter. But that lie that he put out had far-reaching effects. because the tactical officers that just absolutely streamed into the Capitol from that minute on were coming into what they believed was an active shooter. Much different approach and disposition than they would have had he said, "Officer involved, the scene is secure. There is no crisis." Whatever the language would have been, but he never corrected himself. And I know the Babbitt family is convinced that that delayed getting medical help to her, and in the end, that could have cost her her life.
Hmm. So to her court proceedings, so you said they ultimately settled on the 5 million, and the venue in Washington D.C. being a problem. The judge who was overseeing this case was apparently very energetic. We'll characterize it. What's the deal with this judge, and who is this person?
Judge Anna Reyes was the second judge in D.C. assigned this case. Judge Gia Cobb had initially drawn the assignment, and I don't know how Reyes ended up with it. I don't know what the internal decision making was, but Judge Reyes is fairly new to the bench. She was appointed by Joe Biden in 2022, and she has a hair trigger. She really was loaded for bear against Judicial Watch from the very first time they appeared uh, by video for a hearing in court. And she, I think, through 3 or 4 hearings, she absolutely lost her temper, blew up, and was lecturing the attorney from Judicial Watch. And probably her famous line is, "Stop talking, stop talking." The attorney's name is Robert Sticht, and she called him Mr. Stitch. She called him Mr. Stitch for 6 months or more until he finally said, "Your Honor, if you don't mind, it's pronounced Sticht." And she did change after that, but she had something in her craw about this suit, and really was prone to an explosive temper. So, if you look at, the judge can make a trial very difficult, and in this case, I suspect it would have been a spectacle.
Now, the judge aside, he said Judicial Watch was handling the proceedings pro bono, but there was another attorney who they've continued to have drama, who was, I guess, originally arranged to have represented the Babbitt family, but then wound up trying to get himself a healthy share of whatever settlement was reached, and actually put the entire negotiation in jeopardy. And you covered down on this one like 3 or 4 weeks ago. Fee hungry ex lawyer put settlement of $30 million Ashley Babbitt lawsuit at risk. Who's this fine member of the bar?
Terry Roberts, or Terrell Roberts III, was the attorney that Aaron Babbitt initially contracted with to represent him and Ashley's estate in doing an investigation to prepare for a lawsuit. He only lasted about a year doing that, and he fired Aaron Babbitt as a client. So he walked away from this and left Aaron without representation. So it's very curious that he would come along after Judicial Watch has done all the heavy lifting and secured a settlement and demanding 40%. Uh, so, he filed a motion to intervene in the case, and that caused probably about a 4 month delay. Well, they went back and forth on this. And eventually, Judicial Watch said, "Look, we'll put 25% of the eventual settlement amount into a trust fund, and then we are going to file for arbitration with the DC Bar Association," which any member of the DC Bar has to abide by this. I think it's called Rule 13 or Rule 9, uh, where if any of the parties files for arbitration, everyone has to abide by it. So that's what Aaron Babbitt's, he had an attorney specifically for this purpose, filed for that, I believe, on May 13th, and that really forced the issue. So of that 5 million, 25% is going to sit in a trust fund awaiting a decision. But he it's amazing to me because I distinctly remember that this attorney was upset with me because we were making discoveries that he should have made, including the fact that Ashley Babbitt punched Zachary Alam in the face and put an end to the rioting. That's something that he didn't discover. And not only that, he continues to insist, Aaron Babbitt, that there was no punch. And if you watch the video, there was a punch. It knocked his glasses off. He admitted to it, uh, that it was a punch, and he also admitted that it was his plan to go up into that side light window, and he would have been shot to death. So his life was saved by Ashley Babbitt. So it's, it's just remarkable when the attorney is not discovering those kind of things. I think there was a loss of trust. Uh, I think Aaron Babbitt questioned just what it was he was getting, but in the end, the attorney said, "I'm walking away," but then still wants the payday.
And the defendant in this litigation is the Department of Justice, correct? No,
Well,
nothing specific to Lieutenant Byrd.
no, it's actually the federal government writ large, but the DOJ, of course, was the agency that handled it, under the Attorney General. And the disposition of this and the attitude towards it, I think, shifted after Trump came into office, at least to some degree. But um, I guess you look at the amount, and I haven't had a chance to ask him this question, to see if there wasn't as much support as they might have expected, and if that was a factor in settling for less than $5 million. But we know that President Trump has a special place in his heart for Ashley Babbitt. He's talked about her for 4.5 years, and he has excoriated Lieutenant Michael Byrd for his negligence in the shooting. So they definitely had a supporter in President Trump, but that did not uh, translate into what I would consider a large settlement.
And everything you've been able to uncover for this entire lawsuit, has that been through the discovery process that they've worked themselves through? I mean, you talk about him going on the radio, and I haven't heard that talked about anywhere else. I've also only heard from you, no one else, about the FBI opening a counterterrorism investigation on Ashley Babbitt after she was no longer alive. What is going on here? I don't understand how we could have a sympathetic president, we could have a sympathetic attorney general, FBI director. We don't need to go through discovery anymore. Like, this all should be fleshed out, particularly in light of the fact that Ashley Babbitt's really high profile, in light of the fact that President Trump is incredibly sympathetic to her story.
Well, what this case really exposed is some of the corruption at the Capitol Police. They covered up for Michael Byrd's incompetence and negligence for a long time. He has a 25-year disciplinary history that was being investigated right up through the end of the last session of Congress in 2024. That going as far back as 2001, where he had a case where he left his post in the speaker's office. The speaker at the time was Denny Hastert of Illinois, and he left his post to go play cards in a cloakroom. And he was confronted by a sergeant or supervisor, and he denied it, even though they have him on Capitol security video going to the card game, going back to the office, then going back to the card game. So that was one of the first cases. But he also had fired into a fleeing vehicle that he said had driven up on the lawn of his home in Maryland, and said he fired through the windshield when he actually fired as the vehicle was fleeing. So he fired into the rear quarter panel. So he wasn't truthful with the county police that investigated that case. And but he was bailed out by the speaker, Hastert, out of that discipline. He's been bailed out of just about every other, including leaving his service weapon on the toilet tank in the Capitol Visitor Center. He was suspended for that, but that's typically a firing offense. When you leave your loaded weapon in a public place where it sat for 55 minutes and could have been picked up by a child.
It seems to me, I mean, I'm going to have to put on my speculation hat here, and I don't want to pressure you to do that, but I'd be interested if you want to weigh in, that so many of these people in Capitol Police have access to, or at least like they're a fly on the wall for many elected officials who might have compromising things all circulating around them, not in public, but at least loud enough that the Capitol Police might be able to glean and gather some compromising material. Do you think that that might have contributed to Lieutenant Byrd's, I believe he's been promoted since, his comfortable landing spots or lack of any sort of discipline for these pretty obvious infractions that would have necessitated more harsh discipline matters?
He was a kind of a special cause for Speaker Pelosi. She declared at a meeting. We have a source who was at the table at this meeting after January 6th, where she issued the dictate that nobody's going to touch Michael Byrd. And she had assigned some of her staff to work with the Capitol Police to take care of Michael Byrd, and that resulted in a $37,000 retention bonus that was paid to him, $21,000 in security upgrades to his Maryland home. And they were actually looking at an even larger cash amount, and they were going to take it out of the Officers Memorial Fund, which is intended to honor the legacy of fallen police officers. And this again was coming out of the Speaker's office. And I heard numbers kicked around at the time of $400,000 or more. That'd be a sizable dent in the memorial fund. But the officers union got wind of it, and they made quite a protest about it. And so that was dropped. And eventually, Capitol Police helped Lieutenant Byrd set up a GoFundMe, which netted him more than $164,000. So he had a lot of help. They put him up in an admiral suite, Joint Base Andrews, large military base. They assigned him a dignitary protection detail. So if he wanted to go out to the cigar bar, which apparently he was prone to do, he had a detail that went with him. And you're talking $400 or $500 an hour to supply that service to him. Again, from the Capitol Police's budget. Um, he wanted to get a weapon back for protection. Capitol Police were going to issue him a department shotgun, but he failed the FBI's background check, and he also failed the proficiency test. And you'd know better than I would on shotgun proficiency what exactly is involved in a proficiency
There
test.
isn't one. It's a familiarization. You fire it a few times to make sure that it doesn't bounce off your shoulder. I guess he failed the familiarization, which doesn't speak well of his marksmanship or ability to handle any sort of firearm. But I guess it sort of checks with the way that your communist Democrats operate. They punish their enemies and reward their friends. And it seems that Michael Byrd is definitely a friend. I mean, if you're taking or trying to pressure the Capitol Police to take money out of a downed officer memorial fund, that I presume there aren't very many Capitol Police officers who die in the line of duty unless they're retroactively declaring having a stroke as dying in the line of duty multiple days after the event. But never in my adult life have I recall any sort of kinetic action going on at the Capitol that would have resulted in the death of a Capitol Police officer. So it seems like the money's just sort of sitting there. It's like a slush fund. That's probably the way they viewed it. But
I think there's been 7 Capitol Police officers who died in the line of duty. And the annual baseball game, the congressional baseball game, is one of the main funding mechanisms for this. And of course, you'll recall there was in 2017 there was a shooting from a Bernie bro who brought a rifle and started firing at the Republicans.
Oh no, it definitely wasn't political. It was suicide by cop, Joe. The FBI told us that.
Yeah, showed up at their and took his own practice while they were having baseball practice. So that game is one of the funders for that. And it's just the whole notion that you would take a fund meant to help the widows and the families of the fallen. And they've had some officers, that were killed in line of duty. They've had some suicides as well. And I know that they were helping those families try to rebuild their lives. But to use it, like you say, like a kitty, and go in and go into the cookie jar and use that to pay off Michael Byrd's mortgage or whatever the original intent was, it screams of impropriety. But he got that kind of protection, including the use of force investigation, which was really more of a use of farce investigation. carried on by the DOJ and the Metropolitan Police Department, which they like to say cleared him of wrongdoing. Well, no, it didn't. It just they said there wasn't enough evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to show that he violated Ashley Babbitt's civil rights. But the report that they issued was chock full of errors. It didn't use the right legal standard. It was sloppy. And I suspect it's going to be redone by the new Justice Department. And I hope we'll be hearing more about that in the near future.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, just even to close this one out, the use of force, because the Capitol Police are not part of the executive branch. It's this weird quasi-existence they have where they're effectively working for the legislative branch, but doing an executive function. I don't really know how to square that with constitutional principles of three co-equal branches of the government, but maybe a discussion for another day. But I presume that they have a use of force policy that closely mirrors what I've seen in local, state, and federal law enforcement. That's the officer has to have a reasonable belief of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or to another person in order to use that force against an individual. And certainly Ashley Babbitt didn't have a weapon, didn't present a threat. I would think that he'd be outside of just about every single deadly force policy. But again, reward your friends, punish your enemies. I want to pivot over to the guy you already mentioned, and that's Helmet Boy. That's Zachary Alam, who Ashley Babbitt was sort of in a shoving match with and eventually came to blows with because he was breaking out windows in the speaker lobby. And you wrote a story about his recent situation because I guess he just got arrested for other things going on. I think he's probably an emotionally disturbed guy. He sort of fits the bill for a person I would identify as being I don't know, someone who could be recruited by a government entity because they're in a compromised position. They're vulnerable. They might be emotionally disturbed, might just be low intelligence, prone to violence, and then they sort of like bring them into some sort of plot to eventually turn it on them. But here, this most recent arrest, he's now facing new state charges. So touched on Zach Alam a little bit. I have watched the video of him. I think I again put on my speculation hat. I think he was probably working on behalf of some government entity as an individual who's trying to incite people, and also because of the access that he had, where he was walking from behind police lines. So work your way backwards. What are the new charges, and what do you think about Zachary Alam?
Well, he was arrested for residential burglary in Virginia, where he apparently, according to the police department charges, entered a home and was confronted by the adult son in the residence. Um, and I don't know what it is he was intending to take with him, but this is the second time that he's had state charges for burglary. When the FBI first apprehended him for January 6th, they raided a motel in Pennsylvania where he, according to the FBI, had stockpiled more than $5,000. I think it was 5,700 worth of merchandise that he had stolen from an antique mall. So he has, and those charges are still outstanding. There's even though that if you look in the Pennsylvania court records, it shows that case is closed, which is very odd because when January 6th came along, those were kind of put in suspended animation, but there was no outcome to him. He has not faced trial, but now he has these new burglary charges in Virginia. He is a very curious presence on January 6th. He absolutely fit the part of the agitator, the rioter, who was everywhere he went, was causing mayhem. He was smashing things against the side of the stone balustrade on the west front. He went into the Capitol and almost came to actually he did come to blows with an elderly gentleman uh, who was just sick of listening to him scream, who grabbed him and slapped him upside the head and told him to shut up. So he was given incredible access. He came into the Capitol. He went up to the fourth floor, which I don't know how he would have known. There was a hidden elevator in the first floor of the Capitol, and then he wound his way back down through some interior stairwells and came out on the second floor, where he was greeted by one of the House Sergeant at Arms officials who walked him up to behind the police lines near the house door. And there's viral video of him coming around that corner. You'd think that maybe he would have been put in cuffs when he suddenly appears out of nowhere like that. But they let him join the crowd where he started causing trouble. And this was at least 10 minutes before he made his way over to the House Speaker's lobby, where it was very over the top what he did. And that the fact that the 3 officers that were there, did not take him out, um, I also find very suspicious that they actually had a duty to do that, because he created the conditions that led to the shooting. I mean, it was chaos. He was egging on other people, taunting the police. He threw some punches that came very close to the sides of the heads of a couple officers. It's you know it, you look at him and you just shake your head and think, what the heck, what the heck's going on with this guy? And he does have a troubled history, some psychiatric issues, and like you said, that kind of fits the profile of a certain type of person.
He also had a couple of wardrobe changes that were captured on video inside the Capitol, which were kind of a head scratcher to me. And then even up to after Ashley Babbitt is shot, he kind of like slips behind a line of officers who are responding to it, and they seem generally unconcerned about him, as then he's changing out of his clothes. And you would think if you heard shots fired and then seeing something dropping out of their clothes, like that might be somebody of interest to you, but apparently it wasn't to them at the time. And I think his access to me speaks volumes of maybe who he was and who he was known to be amongst law enforcement present that day. And maybe we'll never really get the details just because of his mental conditions that he suffers from. I want to pivot over some definitely some lesser known people that are still suffering, because although President Trump issued the pardons, there are still stories that are outstanding and people that are still suffering from fallout and are trying to be made as whole as they possibly can. And I was reading about Mark Griffin, who you've touched on, and the physical trauma he suffered, and then also the injustice that he's facing from, again, a broken judicial system that's refusing to allow him to actually seek remedy for it. You wrote about Mark, I think it was a couple weeks ago, and
Yes.
it was exclusive that you've stayed in contact with him. Some background on his injuries he suffered and the injuries he continues to suffer on behalf of our Juris Doctorates wearing black robes in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, Mark went there, as most people did, to listen to the president speak. He walked over to the Capitol along with tens of thousands of other people, and he made his way up onto the West Plaza. The police had just established a line using bicycle racks, and he went up and down the police line, talking to a lot of fairly young officers that he noticed looked terrified, saucer eyes, just like they were expecting that they were going to die. And so he tried to calm officers, say, "Look, here's why I'm here. I Our legislature has some issues with election integrity, and that's why we're down here." And he had a cap that had the Constitution printed on the inside of it. He would take that off and show it to the police officer and say, "Look, this is my bill of sale, and it's yours too. And this is why I'm here. Nobody's here to hurt you. We didn't come here to hurt you." And eventually, the police line moved back a little bit, and so he was in front of some different officers. And then, just shy of 2 p.m., a Metropolitan Police officer came up to the line with a 40 millimeter munition launcher and was very keyed up. And Mark tried to tell him, he told him to calm down. He said, "Look, we're not here to cause trouble." And this officer was almost screaming at him, saying, "Stop shaking the fence." Well, he hadn't even touched the fence. So there was something brewing to happen. And then, Mark, he, he had a little plastic pellet in his hand that had been shot at his ankles. And he held that up and was showing it to the officer. And then he pitched it to the ground. And the officer raised his weapon and fired from about 3 feet away. And he split uh, a leg bone right down lengthwise, caused a massive trauma. And as he was trying to limp away, another officer reached over the fence and shot him in the face with pepper spray. So he got insults added to injury, and somehow hobbled his way back to the tour bus to Pennsylvania with a very badly broken femur, which had swollen up so much it splinted itself. But he ended up having to have multiple surgeries. He had a titanium rod put in his leg with 14 screws. So he spent a good year in recovery. And he's a self-employed truck driver. Um, and he, after he started to contemplate all this, he decided he wanted to file a lawsuit, which he did. That really a day before the statute of limitations ran out. Civil rights lawsuit. But a DC judge, in her wisdom, a few months ago, said he can't sue the officer who shot him. She claimed that the statute of limitations had expired when they added this man to the suit, even though they didn't know his name at the time. His identity did not become clear until we provided some visual evidence of exactly who was that shot him. So right now he's really out of luck. He's not able to seek redress. He's not able to seek any sort of pain and suffering remuneration, uh, and he's just left hanging out there.
And he couldn't even find out the identity of the officer until the last moment either, which is again, as long as we're going to go down the process road, like the government withholds the information that you would need in order to bring a lawsuit until the last moment or until the statute of limitations expires, and then conveniently hands it over to you. I don't think that fits a bill for due process. And he's fighting, I believe it's like a $3 million lawsuit. Now you would hope that it meets with some sympathetic ear over at Department of Justice. And have you been in contact with him has he had any sit down meetings with people there, like, your Ed Martin types who are overseeing the weaponization?
He hasn't yet, but I've encouraged that because that's really the only kind of the court of last resort is that the DOJ and the new U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia can take a look at that case as an assault on Mark Griffin. There's a 5-year statute of limitations on that. So the DOJ could definitely bring charges against Sergeant Frank Edwards and others. I mean, this practice of firing upon protesters from point blank range, that happened many times that afternoon. And we don't even know all the injuries that may have been caused because people did not volunteer that. Because if they did, they likely would have been given the SWAT treatment and hauled in front of a magistrate in DC and at least get the 4 standard misdemeanors. So there's people out there that suffered serious injuries that day, and we may never know about it.
All right, let's 2 more stories that I've got from you. Let's end on a little bit of like a lighter, a nicer note, something that maybe makes us smile, because so much of the stuff is still pretty dark. You would think that it would be happy days are here again. Again, we're based now. America's so back, baby. And then you have a guy like Mark there who's has life completely in shambles and has no sort of certainty that he's going to be made anywhere close to whole. But we've got a couple of ones you wrote here. Celebrating life after January 6th, which covers down on the Westbury family and Aaron James. Can you give us some background on that one and where things currently stand with them?
Yeah, the Westbury family went to DC. It's the same type of profile. Family went there, felt obligated to witness what was going on and to stand up for election integrity. And Aaron James and this is his half brother, Isaac, they ended up outside the Lower West Terrace tunnel. And they ended up trying to defend Roseanne Boyland, who died that day. They picked up some police shields that were laying on the ground, and they did not use them to assault anyone. They used them to try to block the bear spray that was coming out of the tunnel from the police, who were actually arcing it over these guys at such an angle that it was raining down on the people doing CPR on Roseanne Boyland. but they were trying to be a wedge or a barrier between. Uh, and there were rioters, as you well know, up at the mouth of the tunnel. There were lots of bad people that were doing bad things, but they were trying to kind of stand in the gap there. And the DOJ came after both Aaron James and his brother Isaac, and two other members of his family. So there were four members of the Westbury family that were being prosecuted, and they went through the same type of thing. They were treated to two SWAT raids on their home, about 6 months apart, and they really put the screws, especially to Aaron, who was a Navy corpsman, served honorably for more than a decade, and they tried to lock him up pending trial, and the lengths they went to try to justify that were, I guess he can laugh about it now, and you'll see in the article a photograph of him holding three, and I don't know exactly what they call these, but they're knife sharpeners. They're the sticks that you use to sharpen a knife, and it's kitchen cutlery, and they date to the Civil War, and he's a Civil War buff, and so he had these in his room, and the probation and parole agent was triggered by that and was going to have tried to have him arrested for it. And I have a great photo in the article of him holding these things up. They're obviously not weapons. They're not a threat to anybody. He explained all this, and as he told them, "Are you guys going to keep giving me trouble about my kitchen cutlery?" So just the lengths that they went to try to make life difficult for this family. But the nice thing about the story is very faith-filled group, and they have become closer and have found a way to move on after they were given pardon and had some case dismissals. But they really went through the ringer, and certainly something they're never going to forget.
And no sort of civil remedies. It's just take it as a life experience, and you're expected to move on. You got your pardon, and hopefully that you can forget the last 4+ years have existed. So, I mean, it is a happy ending, but at the same time, there's no way you can unring the bell that's already been rung for these people. A SWAT raid at your house multiple times. I think it sort of speaks to the volumes about the way that the process was made the punishment for so many of the people. One more, and this is a story that Garrett and I have touched on a little bit, and that was Thomas Caldwell, who was alleged to be, I guess, one of the ringleaders of the Oath Keepers. And I'd be interested in your perspective on one thing before we get to him, because it's been my contention when it comes to Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and now we have painted them as these domestic terrorist organizations. Just coming from the inside, there was always going to be an effort to invent, if they needed to, an organization. They didn't want to have individuals who were acting outside the bounds of the law. They wanted to have some sort of conspiracy. They wanted to have some sort of organization that they could label as the real driving force behind it. And I really, truly believe that Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and I know they come from different circles. I know that they maybe overlap a little bit here or there at certain events, but they mostly operate independently of each other. But they're sort of cast into the same lot. They just happen to have the bad luck of being clubs of people that had a title and a website, and the FBI said, good enough for us. Let's try to make this some sort of a terrorism cell as opposed to an individual activity. Your thoughts on that before we get to Mr. Caldwell?
Well, I think the FBI was looking for a reason to mess up the Oath Keepers for a long time. It's my contention they started monitoring Stuart Rhodes and his group of military veterans and first responders back in 2009 when they had their inaugural event on Concord Green. These are patriots. These are not terrorists. It's not even a militia. This is not a group that goes out in the woods and practices, for instance, trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan. These are law enforcement veterans. There were some FBI special agents who were members. There were judges who were members. They had about 40,000 membership at their peak, but they were the boogeymen. They were the designated boogeymen, and the DOJ concocted this absolutely fantastic, and lowercase f story to pin this whole thing on them. It didn't match up with the facts. Uh, the, the ringleader who was supposedly directing people to go storm into the Capitol uh, at the very time was standing up on the upper terrace giving an interview to Rosemary Westbury, the family we just talked about, and explaining who the Oath Keepers are and what they do. So, if you're commanding an invasion force, you're not gonna stop and give an interview to some random person. Um, and considering the FBI said there was no plan for the Oath Keepers to go into the Capitol, yet they were all convicted. Thomas Caldwell and four others uh, were convicted of at least some charges. Stuart Rhodes, his charges included seditious conspiracy. Kelly Meggs was also convicted of seditious conspiracy. Um, at some point, we will reconstruct that entire case and that entire trial and try to figure out how it is they engineered uh, what's really a miscarriage of justice. The evidence wasn't there, yet the judge allowed them and told the jury that you can have an implied conspiracy, and it can be at the instant that the crime is committed. That kind of opens it up to a real Pandora's box. And
I
how do you
mean,
win? How do you win?
heads I win, tails you lose.
Yeah.
Now to the story about Tom Caldwell. So justice finally arrives for a newly pardoned January 6th defendant, and he was the individual who let guys like camp out on his house, on his property, right? I mean, he was not the ringleader as he was portrayed by this courtroom proceeding. And I believe that he was one of the first ones who was scooped up, probably because he had an affiliation with Oath Keepers. What about Mr. Caldwell?
Yeah, his was really a miscarriage of justice. As you mentioned, he let some of the Oath Keepers park their campers on his farm property in Virginia. He met Stuart Rhodes once. They had a brief discussion. He did not know Stuart Rhodes, and they made him the ringleader. The first indictment that he was, they said he was the leader of the Oath Keepers. He was not a member of the Oath Keepers, yet he was made the ringleader of the whole thing, which of course was never the case. They stitched together a lot of talk that he made in private messages to colleagues, where he talked about things like wiping his rear end on Nancy Pelosi's doorknob and other things that were used against him, claiming that he wanted to take duck boats and run weapons across the Potomac uh, in order to be used in an invasion of the Capitol. It's absolutely ludicrous. There wasn't a shred of truth to any of it, and he most of the charges that were brought against him, the jury did found him not guilty of. So he ended up with only one charge standing by the time he went to sentencing. And the judge in that case looked at him and said, "You've been through enough." And he let him go that day on time served. Um, but Tom was tortured in jail when he was jailed before trial. He was beaten. He was mocked. Uh, his Christian faith was mocked, and he had gotten to such a low point that he didn't know how he was going to keep going on. So he's probably been one of the people that's physically and emotionally suffered the most of all the J6ers. And so, and eventually he did get a pardon, even though he wasn't sentenced to anything more than time served. He wanted that uh, to be removed from his record for all the things he went through. So for him, it is a feel good story because he lost just about everything.
I mean, I think he was like close to 1,000 days of home confinement for one charge that, if it had been brought not at the district level, at the superior level in Washington, D.C., which is where most local crimes are, would have probably been laughed out of court because they have other things going on in Southeast D.C., like people murdering each other and carjacking each other.
Exactly.
All right, so we ran through a bunch of them, Joe, and I know you're continually putting things out there. I want to definitely steer people over to you over at the Blaze, and can you maybe tease some other things you might have working in the hopper here in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I'm working on a profile of another family that was prosecuted by the DOJ, the Tom and Dawn Munn family, which at the time of January 6th, they were living in a city named Borger, Texas. And it was the trip to DC on January 6th was a high school graduation gift for one of their daughters. They went to the speech, went to the Capitol, and they went inside the Capitol and entered through one of the broken windows on the Senate side, which, admittedly, and they fessed up to that wasn't a smart thing to do. But they spent 52 minutes inside the Capitol. They picked up garbage. They picked up, someone had thrown George W. Bush's portrait on the floor. They picked that up and set it out of harm's way. And they spent the rest of their time trying to figure out how to get back out of the Capitol, which is, a bit of a labyrinth, very confusing. And for that 52 minutes, 5 members of the family were prosecuted, and the parents were sent to jail and given home confinement, as was the oldest daughter. She was just given home confinement. And the judge was extremely harsh with them. Beryl Howell, who's one of the, I don't even know the correct term to describe her, but she took personal offense to what they did and made it seem like they had virtually brought the constitutional republic to its knees that day, when the truth is these are God-fearing, flyover country Americans who went there to witness, and they suffered a pretty heavy burden. Again, they got triple swatted. They'd had 3 locations swatted at the same time in 2 different states. And eventually they pleaded to a parading charge, this ridiculous petty misdemeanor parade. At some point in Capitol history, they must have run a parade through the Capitol with elephants and music and who knows what. But they pleaded to a parading charge, but again, ended up behind bars for it.
It goes back to the fundamental question of why do we have laws? Are they supposed to be a shield against evildoers to protect the innocent against fraud and force? Or are they supposed to be a sword, which is used to go after your political enemies to punish them like the communists want to do? And unfortunately, January 6th is probably one of the worst examples we've ever seen, where the process was the punishment and the law was weaponized and evolved from being a shield into a sword. And I'm grateful that you've stayed on it. You didn't say America's so back, baby, and we're based now, and we're going to give amnesty to all these stories, and you've highlighted them and continue to do so. So thanks for doing that, and thanks for joining me today. You can catch everything that Joe puts out on at the Blaze, and I've got your X handle at Hannah Blaze 64. I'll throw it up there as opposed to the American Radicals, so folks can take note of that. If you're on the X, Joe's a good follow there, and always over at the Blaze. So thank you again for joining me today, Joe. I appreciate the insights you bring in, and we're going to continue to try to highlight it whenever you're dropping them. Keep texting them over me, man. I try to share them as much as I can.
I will do that. Thanks for having me on.
You got it. All right. So that is going to do it for us today on the American Radicals podcast. We'll be back with you Saturday for a Saturday grab bag, 10:30 Eastern time on rumble.com/amradpod. If you haven't already, give us a thumbs up, follow the channel. Back with you Saturday. Until then, guys, have a great day.
You've been listening to the voice of the Suspendables on the American Radicals podcast. Follow us on rumble.com/amradpod.